Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small, heartfelt request. Please subscribe to my channel. Give this video a like. It costs you nothing but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes a difference. "I can't carry this secret anymore," my grandmother whispered, her weathered hand gripping mine with surprising strength. "You need to know the truth about who you really are." Her words hit me like ice water. I stared at her lying in that sterile hospital bed, machines beeping softly around us, and felt my entire world begin to crack. The antiseptic smell of Cedars-Sinai Medical Center seemed to intensify as I processed what she'd just said. "What do you mean, Grandma Rose?" I asked, though something deep in my stomach already knew I didn't want the answer. She turned her head away, staring at the window where Los Angeles traffic hummed below us on Wilshire Boulevard. It was March 15th, 2024, and I had no idea this ordinary Thursday afternoon would shatter everything I thought I knew about my life. "You and Victoria," she said, her voice barely audible above the heart monitor. "When you were 3 months old, I switched you." The words hung in the air like smoke. I felt my breath catch, my throat constricting as if someone had their hands around my neck. The plastic visitor's chair suddenly felt unsteady beneath me. "That's impossible," I whispered. But even as I said it, puzzle pieces I'd never understood began clicking into place in my mind. Why had I always felt like an outsider in my own family? Why did my twin sister Victoria seem to fit so perfectly while I struggled to belong? Why did my parents' love feel conditional, earned, while hers seemed automatic? Grandma Rose turned back to me, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Your mother was so overwhelmed with 2 babies. Victoria cried constantly, barely slept. You were peaceful, easy. When your parents went on that weekend trip to Santa Barbara, leaving you both with me, I thought I was helping." My hands began to shake. 30 years. I had been living someone else's life for 30 years. The truth about identity has a way of rewriting everything that came before it. I sat frozen in that hospital chair, staring at the woman who had just torn my reality in half. Grandma Rose looked so small in her hospital gown, but her confession had the weight of an earthquake. "You switched us?" My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. "You mean Victoria and I?" "Victoria was supposed to be you," she interrupted, her eyes pleading for understanding. "And you were supposed to be Victoria. I put you in her crib and her in yours before your parents came to pick you up." The heart monitor beside her bed seemed to grow louder, each beep echoing in my skull. I thought about my childhood, always feeling like I was wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. My parents, Linda and Robert Thornfield, had always seemed puzzled by me. My quiet nature, my love of books, my preference for solitude, none of it matched their expectations. Victoria, on the other hand, had been their golden child. Outgoing, charismatic, naturally athletic. She'd gotten into Stanford on a softball scholarship, while I'd struggled to pay for community college. She'd married Derek Chen, a successful tech entrepreneur, in a wedding that cost more than my annual salary. I'd attended alone again. "Why?" I managed to ask. "Why would you do that?" Grandma Rose's breathing became labored. A nurse in purple scrubs peered through the door, but I waved her away. This conversation couldn't wait. "Your parents were so young, only 22. Your father had just started his accounting practice. Your mother was barely keeping it together." She paused, gathering strength. "Victoria. The baby you knew as Victoria. She never stopped crying. Colic, the doctor said. Your parents were at their breaking point." I remembered family stories about my difficult infancy, how I'd been such a challenging baby that my mother had suffered from postpartum depression, how they'd almost considered giving one of us up for adoption because the stress was too much. "But I wasn't the difficult one," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "No, sweetheart. You were the easiest baby I'd ever seen. You slept through the night from 8 weeks old. You rarely cried. I thought if I switched you, everyone would be happier." My phone buzzed with a text from my supervisor at Valley Medical Center, where I worked as a radiology technician. I ignored it. Nothing in my normal life mattered anymore. "What about Victoria? Did she know?" No one knew except me. Grandma Rose's voice was getting weaker. I planned to tell you both when you turned 18, then when you graduated college, then when you got married. There was never a right time. I thought about Victoria's natural confidence, the way she'd always seemed to know exactly who she was and what she wanted. Meanwhile, I'd spent 30 years feeling like I was playing a role I'd never auditioned for. The irony was devastating. I'd been living her life while she'd been living mine. Sometimes the truth arrives exactly when you're least prepared to handle it. 3 days passed before I could bring myself to leave the hospital. Grandma Rose had slipped into a coma the night of her confession, leaving me alone with the most explosive secret I'd ever been entrusted with. I sat in my studio apartment in Koreatown, staring at my birth certificate, the one that had always said Sarah Michelle Thornfield, born June 12, 1994, 6:47 a.m. According to Grandma Rose, this document was a lie. I was actually Victoria Thornfield, and my twin sister was actually Sarah. My phone had been ringing nonstop. Victoria, worried about Grandma Rose. My parents, asking why I hadn't been to work. My supervisor, growing increasingly frustrated with my unexplained absence. But I couldn't face any of them yet. How do you look at people you've known your entire life when everything you thought you knew about them, and yourself, has been turned inside out? I'd always wondered why I looked different from Victoria, despite being identical twins. Her hair was naturally straighter, her face slightly rounder. Doctors had explained it as normal variation, even in identical twins. Now I realized we weren't identical at all. We were fraternal twins who'd been living each other's lives. The knock on my door came at 2:17 p.m. on Sunday. I knew it was Victoria before I looked through the peephole. She had this way of knocking, confident, rhythmic, exactly 4 times. "Sarah, I know you're in there," she called through the door. "Your car's in the parking lot, and Mrs. Gonzalez saw you yesterday." I opened the door. Victoria stood there in her expensive workout clothes, her long blonde hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail. She looked like she'd just come from a yoga class in Beverly Hills, which she probably had. "You look terrible," she said, pushing past me into my small living space. "When's the last time you showered?" I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror as she walked by. She was right. My brown hair was greasy, my eyes were red from crying, and I was still wearing the same UCLA Medical Center t-shirt I'd had on for 3 days. "I've been worried sick," Victoria continued, settling onto my secondhand couch like she owned it. "Grandma Rose is in a coma, you've disappeared, and Mom and Dad are freaking out. What's going on?" I stared at her. This person who'd unknowingly stolen my life simply by existing. The woman who'd gotten my parents' unconditional love, my college opportunities, my social confidence. Everything that should have been mine. "Grandma Rose told me something," I said carefully, testing the words, "before she went into the coma." Victoria's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose. "What kind of something?" I sat down across from her, my hands trembling. "Something about when we were babies." For the first time since I'd known her, Victoria looked genuinely nervous. She shifted on the couch, her designer water bottle crinkling in her grip. "What about when we were babies?" The moment hung between us like a blade ready to fall. The hardest truths are the ones that make perfect sense once you hear them. "Victoria," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "what if I told you that everything we've believed about ourselves is wrong?" She laughed, but it sounded forced. "I'd say, you've been watching too many soap operas. Sarah, you're scaring me." I pulled out my phone and showed her a photo I'd taken of Grandma Rose's journal, the one she'd kept hidden in her nightstand drawer. I'd found it after hours of searching her house in Pasadena while Uncle Jerry dealt with the hospital paperwork. "Read this entry from May 1994, I said, handing her the phone. Victoria squinted at the handwritten text. I watched her face change as she read Grandma Rose's careful script. The switch was necessary. Linda couldn't handle the colicky baby anymore. Robert was talking about institutional care. I saved both families by giving them the easy child. Victoria will thrive with the Thornfields. Sarah will have to be strong. "This is impossible," Victoria whispered. but I could see understanding dawning in her eyes. Grandma Rose was old, maybe confused. She wasn't confused, I interrupted. She knew exactly what she was saying. She told me we were switched when we were 3 months old. You've been living my life, and I've been living yours. Victoria set down the phone with shaking hands. That's insane. We look exactly alike. Do we, though? I asked. Really look at me, Victoria. Look at yourself. We've never actually looked identical. She studied my face with an intensity I'd never seen from her before. I could practically see her mind racing, connecting dots she'd probably wondered about for years. Your bone structure, she said slowly. It's different, more angular. And your hair texture, your height. You're 2 inches taller than me. Fraternal twins, she breathed. Fraternal twins living each other's lives. The silence stretched between us. Outside my apartment window, I could hear children playing in the courtyard, their laughter a stark contrast to the heaviness in my living room. But that would mean, Victoria started, then stopped. That would mean you got my parents' love by accident, I finished. That you got my college fund, my opportunities, my place in the family. That I've been the outsider my entire life because I was literally supposed to be someone else. Victoria's face went pale. Sarah, I didn't know. I never knew. Of course you didn't know. But think about it. Didn't you ever wonder why everything came so easily to you? Why Mom and Dad seemed to understand you instinctively while they looked at me like I was a puzzle they couldn't solve? She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her manicured hands. I thought you were just different. I am different. I'm not their biological daughter being raised as someone else. The weight of that statement hit both of us simultaneously. Truth has its own timeline, and sometimes 30 years is just the beginning. Victoria stood up abruptly, pacing to my small kitchen window that overlooked the alley behind my building. Her reflection in the glass looked distorted, fractured, which seemed appropriate given the circumstances. This changes everything, she said, her voice hollow. For both of us, I replied. She turned back to me, and for the first time in our lives, I saw genuine vulnerability in her expression. What do we do with this information? It was such a Victoria question. Practical, action-oriented. She'd always been the problem solver while I'd been the overthinker. Except now I realized those might not have been our natural personalities at all. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to march into Mom and Dad's house and demand answers. Another part of me wants to pretend Grandma Rose never told me. But she did tell you. Victoria sat back down, this time on the edge of the couch. And now you've told me, so we can't unknow it. My phone rang. The caller ID showed Mom. We both stared at it until it went to voicemail. I can't talk to them yet, I said. Not until I figure out what this means. Victoria nodded slowly. What about our birth certificates? Our medical records? If Grandma Rose switched us, wouldn't there be some kind of paper trail? It was a good question, the kind of logical thinking that had always come naturally to her. I wondered if that analytical mind should have been mine, if she'd somehow inherited traits that were meant for me. I've been thinking about that, I said. The birth certificates were probably issued before the switch, but medical records, school records, everything after 3 months old, that would all be wrong. Blood types, Victoria said suddenly. I'm A positive, you're B negative. If we were switched, then your parents have the wrong blood type information for both of us. The implications were staggering. Every medical emergency, every blood test, every assumption about our genetic makeup, all of it was based on a lie that our grandmother had carried for 3 decades. Victoria pulled out her phone and started typing rapidly. I'm looking up the symptoms of colic in infants, she said. Grandma Rose said I was the colicky baby, right? That's why she switched us? I leaned over to read her screen. Excessive crying, difficulty sleeping, digestive issues, general fussiness. Did you have any of those problems as a child? Actually, yes. Her voice was barely a whisper. I had terrible digestive issues until I was 12. Remember how I was always seeing specialists? And I've had insomnia my entire life. My stomach dropped. I've never had any of those problems. And you were always the healthier one. Never missed school, rarely got sick, slept like a rock. We stared at each other, the evidence mounting like stones in a wall we couldn't tear down. Victoria, I said carefully, what if we could prove it? What if we could get definitive proof that we were switched? DNA testing, she said immediately. We could test against Mom and Dad's DNA. Are you ready for that? Are you ready to know for certain that the parents who raised you aren't your biological parents? Her face crumpled slightly. Are you ready to know that the parents who never quite understood you had a good reason? Neither of us had an answer for that. Some secrets are buried so deep that digging them up changes the entire landscape. The DNA testing kit arrived via 2-day shipping on Tuesday morning. Victoria had ordered 2 sets from different companies. She wanted to be absolutely certain. We met at her house in Manhattan Beach, a beautiful craftsman bungalow that Derek had bought for them as a wedding gift. I felt strange walking through rooms I'd been in dozens of times, knowing that this house should have been mine, if Victoria's life was actually my life. The wedding photos on the mantel showed her in a $15,000 Vera Wang dress, surrounded by relatives who'd always treated her like the family princess. I keep thinking about Christmas mornings, Victoria said, as we sat at her granite kitchen island, the DNA kits unopened between us. How excited Mom and Dad always got about my presence, how they seemed to just go through the motions with yours. I remembered those Christmas mornings too, the careful equality of gift-giving that never felt quite right. Victoria always got things that seemed perfectly chosen for her. Art supplies, sports equipment, clothes that fit her personality exactly. My gifts felt like afterthoughts, well-meaning but slightly off-target. What about college, Wade? I asked. You got into Stanford. I couldn't even get financial aid for a 4-year school. That's what I don't understand, Victoria said, picking at the DNA kit packaging. If we were switched, why wouldn't you have gotten the same opportunities? It was a fair question, and one I'd been puzzling over. Maybe it's not just about the switch, I said slowly. Maybe it's about how our personalities developed in response to being in the wrong families. Victoria looked confused. Think about it, I continued. You grew up feeling loved and supported, so you became confident and outgoing. I grew up feeling like I didn't quite belong, so I became withdrawn and self-doubting. By the time we were old enough for things like college applications, we'd become completely different people than we might have been. So the switch didn't just affect where we lived, it affected who we became. Exactly. The kitchen timer Derek had set for his afternoon conference call started beeping. Victoria turned it off absently, but the sound reminded me that her husband was upstairs, unaware that his wife's entire identity was in question. Have you told Derek? I asked. Victoria shook her head. I can't, not yet. What if we're wrong? What if Grandma Rose was confused or... She trailed off, but I could hear the desperation in her voice. She wasn't confused, I said gently. You know she wasn't. Victoria picked up one of the DNA kits, turning it over in her hands. If we do this, everything changes. Our relationships with Mom and Dad, our sense of who we are, even our medical histories. Everything's already changed, I pointed out. We just don't know the details yet. She was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at her perfectly manicured backyard. Sarah, she said finally, what if the test confirms it? What if we really were switched? Then we deal with it, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Together. And what if it doesn't? What if Grandma Rose was wrong somehow? I hadn't really considered that possibility. Part of me had been so certain of the truth that alternative explanations seemed impossible. Then we figure out why she thought we were switched, I said. Either way, we need to know. Victoria nodded slowly, then tore open the first DNA kit with determination I recognized. It was the same focused intensity she brought to everything in her life. Except now, I wondered if that intensity should have been mine. The truth doesn't wait for you to be ready. It arrives on its own schedule. The DNA results came back on a Friday. Victoria called me at 6:23 a.m., her voice shaking so badly I could barely understand her. "The results are in," she said. "Both companies." I sat up in bed, my heart immediately racing. "And? Can you come over? I can't do this over the phone." 30 minutes later, I was back in her kitchen, both of us staring at her laptop screen. Derek had left early for a business trip to San Francisco, so we were alone in the house that suddenly felt like it belonged to a stranger. Victoria's hands trembled as she opened the first email. The results from 23andMe were straightforward. 99.9% probability that Victoria Thornfield was not a biological match to Linda and Robert Thornfield. But I was. The second company, Ancestry DNA, confirmed it with the same clinical precision. I was the biological daughter of Linda and Robert Thornfield. Victoria was not. 30 years, Victoria whispered, staring at the screen. 30 years of living someone else's life. I felt strangely numb. Part of me had been hoping I was wrong, that Grandma Rose had been confused, that this was all some elaborate misunderstanding. But the science was undeniable. "We need to find your biological parents," I said quietly. Victoria looked at me with something that might have been panic. "What if they don't want me? What if they gave me up for a reason?" "Grandma Rose said she switched us. That means your biological parents probably think you died as an infant, or they've been looking for you for 30 years. The weight of that possibility settled over both of us. Somewhere out there, two people might have spent 3 decades grieving a daughter who was actually alive, successful, married, living in Manhattan Beach. Victoria's phone started ringing. The caller ID showed Mom. "I can't," Victoria said, staring at the phone. "I can't talk to her right now." "You have to at some point," I said gently. "They're going to notice we're both avoiding them." "But what do I say? Hi, Mom. Turns out I'm not actually your daughter?" The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. "Let me answer it," I said, reaching for the phone. "Sarah? No." But I was already swiping to accept the call. "Hi, Mom." "Finally!" Linda Thornfield's voice was sharp with frustration. "I've been trying to reach both of you for days. What's going on? Is this about Grandma Rose?" I looked at Victoria, who was shaking her head frantically. "We're fine, Mom," I said carefully. "Just dealing with some things." "What things?" "You both disappeared after Grandma Rose went into the coma. Your supervisor called looking for you, Sarah, and Victoria missed her book club meeting, which she never does." My mother's attention to Victoria's schedule and casual dismissal of my job troubles felt different now, sharper, more painful. Of course, she noticed Victoria's social commitments while treating my professional responsibilities as an afterthought. "We just need some time," I said. "Time for what?" "If this is about Grandma Rose's condition, the doctors say she could wake up any day. There's no need for this dramatic behavior." Dramatic behavior. That was my mother's explanation for everything I did that she didn't understand. "Mom," I said, making a decision that surprised even me, "we need to have a family meeting, all 4 of us, tomorrow." "A family meeting? Sarah, what's gotten into you?" "Just trust me. It's important." There was a long pause. "Fine. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. Your father and I will be home." She hung up without saying goodbye. Victoria was staring at me with wide eyes. "What did you just do?" "I gave us 24 hours to figure out how to tell our parents that everything they think they know about their daughters is wrong. Truth has a way of demanding its own space, regardless of how inconvenient the timing might be. We spent the next 24 hours rehearsing different ways to break the news to our parents. Victoria wanted to start with the DNA results and work backward to Grandma Rose's confession. I thought we should begin with what Grandma Rose had told me and let them process it before showing them the scientific proof. By Saturday afternoon, we'd settled on my approach, though neither of us felt prepared for what was about to happen. Our parents' house in Brentwood hadn't changed much since our childhood. The same beige walls, the same family photos arranged on the piano, the same sense that I was visiting a place where I didn't quite belong. Except now I understood why, because I actually didn't belong there. Mom had made coffee and set out store-bought cookies on the good china, which meant she was nervous. Dad was in his usual Saturday outfit of khakis and a polo shirt, reading the Wall Street Journal at the kitchen table. "So," Mom said as we settled in the living room, "what's this all about?" Victoria and I exchanged glances. We'd agreed that I would do most of the talking, since I was the one Grandma Rose had confided in. "It's about something Grandma Rose told me," I began, "the day before she went into the coma." Dad lowered his newspaper. "What did she tell you?" I took a deep breath. "She told me that when Victoria and I were 3 months old, she switched us." The silence that followed was deafening. Mom's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. Dad's newspaper rustled as his hands began to shake slightly. "She what?" Mom's voice was barely a whisper. "She switched us in our cribs while you were away for the weekend. Victoria was colicky, barely sleeping, and you were both at your breaking point. Grandma Rose thought she was helping by giving you the easier baby." "That's impossible," Dad said immediately. "We would have noticed." "Would you?" I asked gently. "We were 3 months old. We looked similar enough that even you might not have been able to tell us apart, especially if you weren't expecting a switch." Mom set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. "Sarah, this is ridiculous. Grandma Rose is 87 years old. She's been confused lately, mixing up names, forgetting conversations." "She wasn't confused about this," I interrupted. "She had details, specific memories, and she wasn't the only one who knew." I pulled out my phone and showed them a photo of a letter I'd found in Grandma Rose's house, a letter from her sister Margaret, written in 1995. "Aunt Margaret knew," I said. "She wrote to Grandma Rose when we were about a year old, asking if she'd told you about the switch yet." Victoria finally spoke up. "We got DNA tests," she said quietly. Both parents turned to stare at her. "We what?" Mom's voice had gone up an octave. "DNA tests," Victoria repeated, pulling out her phone, "to see if we're actually your biological daughters." She showed them the results. I watched my parents' faces as they read the clinical language that had shattered our reality. Victoria Thornfield showed no genetic markers consistent with being the biological offspring of Linda and Robert Thornfield. Sarah Thornfield showed a 99.9% probability of being their biological daughter. The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Finally, Dad spoke. "This can't be right." "It's right," I said softly. "Both companies gave us the same results." Mom was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she looked back and forth between Victoria and me. "But that means," she started, then stopped. "That means you raised the wrong daughter," Victoria finished, her voice breaking, "and that my real parents have no idea I'm alive. Some moments divide your life into before and after, and there's no going back to before. The aftermath of our revelation was unlike anything I could have predicted." Mom immediately went into what I can only describe as grief overdrive, crying, pacing, calling Grandma Rose's hospital room even though she was still in a coma, demanding to speak with doctors about reversing DNA tests. Dad retreated into practical mode. He wanted to see the original DNA test results, not just the printouts. He called the testing companies to verify the results hadn't been tampered with. He asked detailed questions about chain of custody and laboratory procedures. Victoria sat quietly on the couch, looking shell-shocked, and I felt something I'd never experienced before in this house, a strange sense of belonging. For the first time in my life, my parents' reactions made sense to me. I understood their emotional language because I was genetically programmed to understand it. "We need to find Victoria's real parents," Mom said suddenly, stopping her pacing. "They need to know she's alive." "Mom," Victoria said softly, "what if they don't want to know me?" "Of course they'll want to know you," Dad said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "You're their daughter." The irony wasn't lost on any of us. Victoria was sitting in a living room with people who'd raised her as their daughter for 30 years, talking about finding her real parents, while I was finally sitting with my actual biological parents, feeling like a stranger. "There's something else," I said, pulling out another document I'd found in Grandma Rose's papers. A birth certificate for a baby girl born the same day as us, but who died at 3 days old. Everyone leaned forward to look at the photocopy. The name on the certificate was Victoria Ann Reyes, born June 12, 1994, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Died June 15, 1994. "Reyes," Victoria whispered. "That's my real last name?" "It appears so," I said. Maria and Carlos Reyes were listed as the parents. Mom looked up sharply. "Maria Reyes? I remember a Maria from the maternity ward. She was in the room next to mine. Her baby." Mom's face went pale. "Oh my God, her baby didn't die." "The baby did die," I said gently. "But Grandma Rose took Victoria, the baby we've been calling Victoria, and put her in place of their deceased daughter. Then she brought the deceased baby to you and told you it was Sarah." "But that baby was buried," Dad said, his logical mind struggling with the implications. "Under my name," Victoria said quietly. "There's a grave somewhere with my name on it and a family who's been mourning me for 30 years. The weight of that realization hit all of us simultaneously. Somewhere in Los Angeles, 2 parents had been visiting a grave marked Victoria Ann Reyes for 3 decades, not knowing their daughter was alive, successful, and living 20 miles away. Mom started crying again, but this time it was different, deeper, more wrenching. "What have we done?" she whispered. "What has our family done to these people?" "It's not your fault," I said, surprising myself by comforting her. "You didn't know." "But Grandma Rose knew," Victoria said, her voice harder than I'd ever heard it. "She knew she was letting another family suffer the worst possible loss while giving you their child." Dad was quiet for a long moment, processing. "We need to find them," he said finally. "The Reyes family. They need to know." "Are you sure?" I asked. "Because once we contact them, everything changes again. For all of us." Victoria stood up abruptly. "I need air," she said, walking toward the front door. I followed her outside to the small front garden where Mom grew roses. Victoria was standing in the middle of the lawn, staring at the house she'd grown up in. "This was never supposed to be my home," she said. "But it was," I replied. "For 30 years it was." She turned to look at me. "And that house in Koreatown was never supposed to be yours." We stood there in the afternoon sun, 2 women who'd been living each other's lives, trying to figure out who we were supposed to be now. Finding people who don't know they're lost requires a different kind of courage than most people possess. The private investigator Dad hired was a woman named Janet Kim, who specialized in family reunification cases. She met us at a small coffee shop in Westwood on Tuesday morning, armed with a leather portfolio and the kind of calm professionalism that suggested she'd handled situations like ours before. "I've located the Reyes family," she said without preamble, sliding a manila folder across the table to Victoria. "Maria and Carlos Reyes, now 64 and 67 years old. They still live in East Los Angeles, about 15 minutes from where you grew up." Victoria's hands shook as she opened the folder. Inside were recent photographs, surveillance shots that Janet had taken from public locations. A woman with graying black hair loading groceries into an older Honda Civic. A man in work clothes leaving what appeared to be an auto repair shop. "They never had other children," Janet continued. "According to public records and interviews with neighbors, they've maintained a shrine to Victoria in their home. They visit Calvary Cemetery every year on June 12th and June 15th, her birthday and the day they believe she died." Victoria was crying now, staring at photos of people who'd spent 30 years grieving her. "There's more," Janet said gently. "They started a scholarship fund in Victoria's memory. They've been funding college educations for underprivileged girls for 25 years. That broke something in Victoria. She sobbed openly in the coffee shop while Janet and I sat quietly, giving her space to process the magnitude of what her absence had meant to these strangers who were actually her parents. "How do we approach them?" I asked when Victoria had composed herself enough to listen again. "Very carefully," Janet replied. "This kind of news can be devastating even when it's good news. I recommend starting with a letter, followed by a phone call, then an in-person meeting if they're willing." "What if they don't believe us?" Victoria asked. "That's why I've prepared this," Janet said, pulling out another folder. "DNA evidence, hospital records from 1994, copies of your grandmother's journal entries, and testimony from Margaret, your grandmother's sister, who confirmed the switch in writing." Victoria looked at me. "Are you ready for this?" I wasn't sure I was ready for anything anymore. My own relationship with Mom and Dad had shifted dramatically since the DNA results. They were trying to treat me the same as always, but there was a new intensity to their attention that felt overwhelming after 30 years of emotional distance. Meanwhile, Victoria was struggling with the opposite problem. The parents who'd raised her were trying so hard to prove their love wasn't conditional that every interaction felt forced and artificial. "I think," I said carefully, "that ready or not, we have to do this. Those people deserve to know their daughter is alive." Victoria nodded slowly. "Will you come with me when we meet them?" "Of course," I said immediately. "We're in this together." Janet slid a sample letter across the table. "I've drafted something that explains the situation while being sensitive to their grief. You'll want to personalize it, but this gives you a framework." I read over Victoria's shoulder. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Reyes, my name is Victoria, and I am writing to you about something that may seem impossible. I have recently learned that I may be your daughter, Victoria Ann Reyes, who you believe died in June 1994. Through a series of discoveries involving my grandmother's deathbed confession and subsequent DNA testing, I have learned that your daughter did not die. She was switched with another infant and raised by a different family." The letter continued with gentle explanations and offers of proof, but Victoria had stopped reading. "I can't send this," she whispered. "What if it gives them false hope? What if we're wrong somehow?" "The DNA doesn't lie," Janet said softly, "and neither did your grandmother's confession. Victoria, those people have been mourning you for 30 years. Don't you think they deserve the chance to stop mourning? The space between a letter being mailed and a response being received is where hope and terror learn to coexist." We sent the letter on a Wednesday. By Friday, Victoria had checked her mailbox 4 times and her email every 20 minutes. By Saturday, she was convinced the Reyes family thought she was a scam artist or mentally ill. "Maybe they threw the letter away," she said as we sat in my apartment, eating takeout Chinese food that neither of us really wanted. "Maybe they thought it was too cruel to be real. Or maybe they're processing the biggest shock of their lives," I pointed out. "If someone told you that your child who died 30 years ago was actually alive, how long would it take you to believe it?" My phone rang before Victoria could answer. Janet Kim's number appeared on the screen. "They called me," Janet said without preamble when I answered. "Maria Reyes. She wants to meet." Victoria grabbed the phone from my hands. "When? Where? What did she say?" "Tomorrow afternoon," Janet's voice came through the speaker. 2 o'clock at Northridge Park. She said she'll be at the picnic table near the playground. She wants you to bring whatever proof you have." "Just me?" Victoria asked. "She specifically asked if you'd be bringing your sister. I think she wants to meet both of you." After Janet hung up, Victoria and I sat in silence for a long time. Tomorrow afternoon, she would meet the parents who'd spent 30 years thinking she was dead, and I would meet the parents I was never supposed to know existed. "What if I don't feel anything?" Victoria asked suddenly. "What if I look at them and they're just strangers?" "Then they're strangers who love you," I said, "and maybe that's enough to start with." The next day, we arrived at Northridge Park 15 minutes early. The playground was busy with families enjoying the Sunday afternoon sunshine. Victoria had dressed carefully, not too formal, not too casual, nothing that might seem like she was trying too hard or not trying enough. At exactly 2 p.m., we saw them. Maria Reyes looked smaller than in Janet's photographs, wearing a simple blue dress and carrying a worn leather purse. Carlos walked beside her, his hand protectively on her back. They both looked nervous, searching the park until their eyes landed on Victoria. The recognition was immediate and devastating. Maria Reyes let out a sound that was part gasp, part sob, and started walking faster. Carlos had to hurry to keep up with her. "Victoria?" Maria called when she was still 20 feet away. "Mija?" Victoria stood frozen as this woman, who was essentially a stranger, approached her with tears streaming down her face. But when Maria reached her and gently touched her cheek, something shifted in Victoria's expression. "You have your father's eyes," Maria whispered, "and my mother's chin. Oh, Mija, we thought we lost you forever." Carlos hung back slightly, his own eyes wet with tears. 30 years, he said softly. 30 years we've been praying for a miracle. I watched from a few feet away as Victoria slowly, carefully, let herself be embraced by the parents who'd never stopped loving her. It was beautiful and heartbreaking and completely overwhelming. "This is Sarah," Victoria said when she was finally able to speak. "My twin sister, the one who was raised as me." Maria turned to me with the same gentle warmth she'd shown Victoria. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for bringing our daughter home." Some stories don't end. They just evolve into new chapters that nobody could have predicted. It's been 6 months since that afternoon in Northridge Park, and our family situation is still complicated in ways that greeting card companies haven't figured out how to address. Victoria has dinner with the Rains every Sunday and has started learning Spanish from Maria. I've been spending more time with the Thornfields, finally understanding why family gatherings always felt like performances I hadn't rehearsed for. Grandma Rose woke up from her coma 3 weeks after our revelation. When we told her what had happened, she cried for 2 hours straight, then spent the next month writing letters to everyone involved, apologies, explanations, and what she called setting the record straight before I meet my maker. The legal implications of the switch turned out to be less dramatic than we'd feared. Statute of limitations protected Grandma Rose from criminal charges, and none of us wanted to pursue civil cases against each other. We were all victims of a well-intentioned decision made by someone who thought she was saving 2 families from tragedy. Victoria and Derek are in couples counseling, working through what it means to rebuild a marriage when one person's entire identity has shifted. She started painting again, something she'd loved as a child, but abandoned because the Thornfields weren't particularly artistic. Turns out creativity runs in the Reyes family. I've been seeing a therapist too, processing 30 years of feeling like I didn't quite fit anywhere. Dr. Sandra Chen, no relation to Derek, has helped me understand that my sense of displacement wasn't a character flaw or oversensitivity. It was an accurate response to actually being displaced. The most unexpected development has been my relationship with Carlos Reyes. He owns an auto repair shop and has been teaching me about engines and electrical systems. Apparently, I have an aptitude for mechanical work that nobody ever discovered because the Thornfields assumed their daughters would pursue white-collar careers. Maria has become something like a second mother to me, which is strange and wonderful and confusing all at once. She makes me tea when I visit and tells me stories about Victoria's first 3 months of life, my first 3 months of life, that my adoptive parents never knew. The hardest part hasn't been adjusting to new relationships, though. It's been grieving the lives we didn't get to live. Victoria will never know what it feels like to grow up with parents who understand her instinctively. I'll never know what it feels like to have 30 years of unconditional love and support behind me as I navigate adult challenges. But here's what I've learned. Identity isn't just genetics or environment. It's the choices you make when you finally understand who you really are. Victoria is choosing to embrace both families while building a life that honors all the parts of herself. I'm choosing to see my displacement as preparation for appreciation, my outsider status as training for empathy. Some people spend their whole lives wondering who they really are. We got the rare opportunity to find out definitively, even if the answer came with more questions than we expected. If there's a lesson in all this, it's that families are more fragile and more resilient than we imagine. Love doesn't disappear when you discover it was built on incorrect information, but it does evolve, deepen, become more intentional. The Thornfields didn't stop loving Victoria when they learned she wasn't their biological daughter. The Reyes family didn't love her less for having been raised by someone else. And I didn't stop being myself when I learned I'd been living someone else's life. I just started living my own life more deliberately. Truth has its own timeline, and healing has its own pace. We're all still figuring out what our new normal looks like, but we're figuring it out together. 2 sets of parents, 2 daughters, and 1 grandmother who finally doesn't have to carry the weight of a 30-year-old secret. If you've enjoyed this journey with us, please take a moment to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Stories like these remind us that family is both simpler and more complicated than we ever imagine, and that sometimes the most life-changing truths come from the people we least expect to hold them. Sarah Michelle Thornfield.